All Things Are Full of Gods is David Bentley Hart's latest book, and it is his philosophical case for an idealist and theistic understanding of consciousness, awareness and mind, and life and language too, in fact, because he argues that all are intertwined. As he summarises, mind and life and language too are possible only by way of a kind of downward causation that informs their upward evolution in particular things, notably, of course, us. The book is also a careful and extensive debunking of materialist, naturalist, alternative explanations for mind, life and language, namely the familiar arguments that mind emerges from matter, or that consciousness is an illusion, or even that consciousness doesn't really exist at all, and we'll stop talking about it when we understand it materialistically. By the end of the book, you are wondering why these materialist options have become defaults. After all, in a way, the critique of them is pretty straightforward for all the complexity that undoubtedly emerges. It comes down to basic things like mind can't emerge from matter because there is nothing whatsoever that is mind-like in matter, at least as traditionally conceived, stuff acted on by forces. And the short answer is that something, mind, can't come out of nothing, mindless matter. Consciousness, similarly, can't be an illusion because of the familiar argument to have an illusion requires being conscious. And the argument that consciousness doesn't exist at all, at least has the merit, David Bentley Hart points out, of being consistent with materialism. And that, though, is at the vast cost of being ridiculous. Why is it ridiculous that consciousness doesn't exist at all? After all, it can be denied in spite of our every waking moment and experience. Well, the philosophical reason is that to turn raw data, say, into coherent representations requires consciousness, which is why a camera, though it collects data, doesn't see. Or alternatively, you might say that judgment is required to entertain thoughts, which is why no computer, whatever else it has done, has had a thought. So one way to read the book is to ask, how have these materialist and naturalist explanations for consciousness gained such ground when, in one way or another, what they achieve are explanations that explain consciousness away? What has been lost is a sense of the remarkable nature of everyday experiencing, so that philosophers and scientists at least can propose we're perhaps zombies or fancy machines or the byproduct of indifferent evolutionary processes. I suspect that part of the problem is that the environments that we live in now have become increasing reflections of this mechanical philosophy, environments that are very functional and utilitarian, bringing tremendous advantages, of course, but channeling our imaginations more and more into functional and utilitarian forms, and so losing sight of what a remarkable thing consciousness is. As a man is, so he sees, William Blake remarked, and modern life makes us into functional beings, eat, drink, work, repeat. And so we're very inclined to see the world as functional too, and our minds as well. Incidentally, William Blake doesn't feature in David Bentley Hart's book, but he does a lot in my mind. So the book itself is a careful examination of everything from eliminativism to integrated information theory, and includes ideas from Daniel Dennett to those of Philip Goff. But it is also a careful explication of the alternative. If you really examine the nature of consciousness, not only do you realize that it's a cosmic fundamental and irreducible to anything else, you also realize that mind is intimately linked to language and also intimately linked to the nature of life itself. All three, mind, language, and life, are semantic phenomena. One way or another, meaning, teleology, and will are integral to mind, life, and language. All three have purposes. They're rationally organized, rational in the older, larger sense of being intelligible and exhibiting intelligence. What is exciting is that we're perhaps on the cusp of a paradigm shift in sciences and philosophy, tipping in this idealist direction. Partly because the materialist alternatives have exhausted themselves, partly because the old prejudices that prevented the commonsensical being treated as the scientific are easing. Personally, I also hugely value the book because it is in a way therapeutic. A nihilistic cosmos has become default, and it is not only intolerable to live in, it is also gaslighting in that it denies the meaningfulness and freedom of our everyday experience because we've forgotten what that meaning and freedom actually is. Little wonder people are anxious, fearful, depressed, possessive, warring. But if you reflect on even the most mundane thought, you can begin to realize something wonderful about your being and the being of reality. And this is part of the joy of reading David Bentley Hart's book. A thought or experience is only possible because you have capacities for attention and intention, for desire and perception, for communication and participation. Following these qualities through leads to the realization that consciousness is not born in us, as if we were like lighthouses casting beams across oceans of indifference, but rather we are born in consciousness. Mind, life, and language are not materialist miracles. They're reflections or echoes or emanations or gifts of the consciousness that bore them and fosters them and lures us back to itself through them. David Bentley Hart integrates insights from theistic traditions and of various kinds, notably Christian, Sufi, and Vedantic. But whilst the book is not theological or practical, it is hugely illuminating. It's a kind of remedy for contemporary psychological and ontological ills found through philosophical reflection. That said, David Bentley Hart also gives plenty of space to the counter-proposals. He wants them to have a full say, trusting that the truth will out. And the book, therefore, is structured in the form of a dialogue. And that really works because it means that not only can errant positions be philosophically disputed, but in a way the bluff can be called, say, on thinking philosophers arguing that they're not really thinking at all. And it also means actually that the woods are never lost to the trees, which is important because reductionism is inclined to go down the rabbit holes and forget that it is burrowing deeper and deeper. Dialogue, you might say, can be anti-reductive, resisting losing sight of the big question or the wider horizon. And on that front, the book really works well too. It also means that the great challenge to the theistic view, namely the existence of suffering, is not sidelined either. As David Bentley Hart puts it, there are oceans of blood that have been spilt throughout evolutionary history. And that should give anyone pause if they believe that evolutionary history is really just God's way of bringing all creatures to the diverse, beautiful, and rich fulfillment of their being, which is the divine being. The problem of suffering is not answered or even that much addressed in the book, though it's referenced. I think I've heard David Bentley Hart say elsewhere that it can't actually be answered, but perhaps from in the midst of suffering, something more than the suffering can be found. Love, for example, that which is greater than us still calls us, even in the midst of suffering, and for we humans at least, calls us too to try and ease that suffering. Let me just say then more about the nature of this dialogue. It's set across 6 days with the conversation taking place between gods, Eros, Hermes, Hephaestus, and Psyche meet and talk. And it opens with an act within which the whole argument can in a way be seen. For Psyche has plucked a beautiful red rose. She claims that contemplating its beauty has led her to a vision in which it has become clear that mental acts are not reducible to material causes, that consciousness, intentionality, and unity of awareness can't be physical or emergent properties, but are instead basic in the order of things, that the foundation of reality is spiritual rather than mechanical or material, that matter is mind-like rather than mind being matter-like, in that matter is always ordered and susceptible to goals and intentions shaped by mind. So matter as we perceive it is the manifestation of mind, and mind can't be a byproduct of matter because mind has nothing mechanical or machine-like about it. Further, Psyche argues that any thought or experience reveals itself to spring from, quote, the mind's transcendental preoccupation with an infinite horizon of intelligibility that, for want of a better word, we should call God, and that the existence of all things is possible only as the result of an infinite act of intelligence that, once again, we should call God, unquote. In summary, contemplating the rose reveals that mind, life, and language are ordered by the transcendentals, what's good, beautiful, and true. And further, if you look at any instance of conscious experience, not just contemplating a beautiful thing like a rose, you'll find the same dynamics at play, which is not to say that people can't be hideously mistaken, of course, and that evil exists as a kind of refusal of the transcendentals. But we all experience this tug or pull of consciousness to wider horizons. Because you might say, sticking with the example of the rose, that a rose is never just a rose. It is a flower of the genus Rosa. A red rose reflects light at roughly 700 nanometers. It's an assembly of cellulose and other organic matter. It's attractive to certain insects. It's attractive to human beings as a symbol, perhaps of loveliness or of love. Again, it makes numerous appearances in poetry and literature. Dante, for example, in the Paradise, saying that a white rose reminded him of the shape of heaven for its organic ordering, for its pure layering, for its flowing symmetries. A rose is also a wonderful thing to look at on a sunny day in the garden, and if put in a vase in a room, it lights up the place. So, a rose is a beautiful thing, and many things can be said about it, but all of that is quite a vision to draw. It's one that William Blake would find completely obvious, being as he could see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, but nonetheless, that extensive, excessive vision from a single thing like a red rose is ripe for challenge. And so the conversation gets going in the book with these claims repeatedly being refuted, alternative explanations for the qualities of consciousness being proposed and found wanting. And in fact, Psyche's theistic vision still stands at the end, if with the qualification that if consciousness can't be accounted for by materialism or naturalism, theism exceeds rational proof as well. Though it can be known in the loving and living of that vision, showing itself not only to be plausible, but the best account of why a rose can elicit such extravagant claims and why life, mind, and language require them too. Maybe I should say a little bit about the materialist alternatives and how David Bentley Hart thinks they fail. Going through the options takes up more than half the book, in fact, but here's just a taster. Say, take emergence. Now, emergence fails, the idea that mind emerges from matter, because to do so, mind from matter would take the so-called strong form of emergence. And David Bentley Hart, in his characters, the gods, argues that this is essentially, at the end of the day, magical thinking. Weak emergence, such as the two explosive elements, hydrogen and oxygen, could form water that puts out fires, that's understandable, because although water is very different from hydrogen and oxygen, it's a form of weak emergence, because the coming together of hydrogen and oxygen neutralizes the explosive elements, forming water that can then put fire out. It's rationally understandable. It's reducible. Water is reducible, you might say, to hydrogen and oxygen. But examples of strong emergence always reveal that an intelligence was acting from without to form that which has, well, not really emerged, but has been made. So take a computer, for example. It's made of purely physical elements that then are put together in such a way as to perform functions that weren't inherent in, the copper, the silicon, the trace elements of the chips, and so on. However, that functionality doesn't emerge from the complex arrangements of silicon and copper alone. Rather, the intentions of a designer, a programmer, a user act through what can be called final causes, the intentions of the programmer, the designer, the user, and the ends that they therefore have in mind. And those final causes utilize the formal features of the elements that are like potentials within the silicon, the copper, and so on, not novelties waiting to emerge from them. So in other words, strong emergence is really a form of formal causation, a top-down shaping of the world. And so when it comes to mind, it is not that mind can be reduced to biology and then chemistry and then physics, but rather physics and then chemistry and then biology are drawn out and formed by mind into bodies and brains as manifestations of that originating mind. And so, to use the Christian phrase, we are made in the image of God. And this makes sense because it's why even if someone has, say, a brain injury so that their individual mentality and their functioning is reduced in some way, we still don't doubt that they're an individual subjectivity warranting the status of being called human, or at least that's only questioned when a very powerful form of materialism takes hold. So their minds are like all minds, constrained by physics, chemistry, and biology, of course. But mind itself is not reducible to the brain, any more than the meaning of a book is found by reducing the book to merely the print on the page. No, you have to read the book, bring that syntax and semantic part of language and consciousness to understand the meaning of a book. So too, mind can't be reduced merely to its material facets. Now, that's emergence. David Bentley Hart arguing that strong emergence is really a form of magical thinking. He takes other kinds of materialist explanation as well. Take functionalism, which is quite widespread in a lot of these philosophical accounts. It's broadly the idea that consciousness is a kind of byproduct or illusion generated by the increasingly complex processing of inputs and outputs or stimuli and responses as organisms appear through evolutionary processes. However, this kind of functionalism fails really for the basic reason that you can't cross the abyss from pure behavior to actual experience. Again, like matter not having anything mind-like about it. Take another very strong claim in the book that language didn't evolve. Now, David Bentley Hart argues that this conclusion comes from, again, thinking about the nature of language, much as thinking about the nature of experience reveals so much about consciousness. Here's how he puts it. He says, the moment there's so much as the first glimmer of language, there's already a whole structure of symbolic meaning in place. It's also interestingly why no algorithm could write, say, War and Peace. In fact, whereas the beauty of an algorithm is that it can reduce complex things to simple functions, the beauty of language is that it's resolutely complex, which is to say that language in a transcendental form must always have been there, and that existence prompts animals to make noises or gesticulations, drawing from above to serve their immediate needs, but with the formal and final causality giving meaning to those sounds and gestures. And of course, in we human beings, language takes the form of words too, that give even greater expression to that prior divine language that we are participating in when we speak. This also says something important about power as well, I think. Power is usually thought about in terms of causes and forces, mechanical metaphors, acting on otherwise inert matter. But the kind of power that comes out from David Bentley Hart's book implicitly suggests that it's really fundamentally about allure, being drawn by the transcendentals, out by beauty, love as the fundamental form of power, you might say, drawing out from a responsive potential that's us, or that's the cosmos as a whole. This is power as a kind of dialogue or mutual creativity. And when a capacity for freedom is present, power becomes distributed as the transcendentals encourage, say, us to explore what is good, beautiful, and true. And so bring those things from potential into actual form. Hence we human beings can choose to say something beautiful. We can try and live beautiful lives. We can purify our minds, which is to say, to learn more fully to cooperate with that which is prior to us and become transparent more and more to that which is most real. That, in a way, is the nature of our freedom. It's perhaps helpful to also tease apart for the key concepts upon which this argument rests, and so flesh it out in that way. One really crucial thing is that when David Bentley Hart talks about consciousness, he's not primarily talking about the psychological self, the particularities and peculiarities of our individual characters when he references consciousness, but rather the transcendental self upon which our particular selves rest, the awareness of awareness, as it's sometimes said. It's not the contents of awareness, but that we are aware itself. And so consciousness is certainly not a property of some kind of substance. Consciousness is not like the property of mass or charge, for example. Rather, consciousness is an act. It's an act in which our mind reaches out to the mind from whence it came, of mind wrestling with meanings, of mind toying with experiences, and so on. Always trying to order things, trying to put them into some sort of coherence, and thereby reflecting the patterns of things within which we participate. Another key understanding for the book is that consciousness is a unity, and a subjective unity at that. Reality appears in our minds as a unified whole. And even someone, say, with a multiple personality disorder, is only split at the level of the psychological selves that they feel they inhabit. For each self still has a unified, single, subjective perspective. And that unified perspective is what it is to be a self, of course, each self participating in that common experience of resting in and on subjectivity as such, not reducible to anything else. The analogue here is that for the same reason we and all living creatures are not machines but organisms. A machine is not a unified whole in the sense that it can be taken apart into its parts and reassembled without the loss of the machine, whereas an organism can't be taken apart into its separate parts without killing the organism. The unity of the organism is part and part of what it is to be an organism, and what we call parts are really facets of that whole. An organism's unity is as much a feature of its existence as the elements within that unity. And in fact, this is one of the things that's becoming increasingly common in the discussion of a post-selfish gene biology. Another feature of consciousness that's really important in the book is intentionality. The more we attend to something, the more aware we become of it through our intention. And the way we attend to something through our intention determines what we might be aware of about it. And hence, the rose can mean many different things to us, from its pure physiology to its symbolic power, because of the attention that we apply to it. Moreover, David Bentley Hart insists that intentionality can't be separated from consciousness, because consciousness is never merely a sense impression, it always is already directed. As Blake summarised again, when he said, "The tree, which moves some to tears of joy, is in the eyes of others only a green thing that stands in the way." If your consciousness sees a tree as a green thing that stands in the way, that's because of your intentionality always shaping that consciousness. Whereas if the tree moves you to tears of joy, that too is because your intentionality is opening you up to the infinite horizons of awareness that the tree participates in, along with everything else. And again, intentionality, along with subjective unity, is something that no machine has. A machine can certainly do things, but only because an intending mind, also called a human being, has made it do those things. Further, you can say that first-person experience subjectivity is really all that there is, because strictly speaking, there's no such thing as a third-person perspective or objectivity. Objectivity being an inference from subjective observers, such as scientists performing experiments or philosophers making an argument. So again, you can see the idealist worldview implicit and running right the way throughout the book's argument. David Bentley Hart's repeated point, as his interlocutors propose, and when they take apart the materialist alternatives, is that everything we might experience explodes with meanings. That is what mind does in response to the life within which it is immersed. And it's not good enough to put that all down to, say, projection or fantasy or illusion, though no doubt those things go on. The point is that projection and fantasy, no doubt making mistakes, themselves imply concepts and hopes and ideas of beauty, which must be prior, therefore, to the projection or fantasy or illusion. Human minds are no doubt inventive, but only because they participate in a wider inventiveness and creativity. Imagination has us, we don't have imagination, William Blake would say. And this is because mind fits life and language fits mind and language fits mind and life. Like a hand fitting a glove, these three things enfold and go together, as the book explicates. The point is that there's a kind of supernova of exchange across the natural world that isn't only syntactic, having structure, but is also semantic, having meaning. These two features are active as much for the insect that's drawn to the rose as to the god-like psyche, who contemplates the rose and can voice much about it. All this said, all this enjoyed, all this teased out wonderfully, the book ends on a downbeat as the gods who have been talking about the state of the modern world and the modern human mind wonder whether the transcendent horizon can ever be rediscovered by we human beings again. Will we ever learn to hear the world speaking with us once more? Will we ever become able to detect the divine presence in our every waking thought and experience? Psyche, soul, is hopeful, though not optimistic. And this is what David Bentley Hart has her say at the end. They, human beings, might yet learn to know themselves in a new way as spiritual beings immersed in a world of spirit, rather than as machines of consumption inhabiting a great machine of production, and remember that which lies deepest within themselves, living mind, the divine ground of consciousness and life, participating in an infinite act of thought and communication, dwelling in a universe full of gods and full of God. And David Bentley Hart's book is, of course, an invitation and a nudge to remember precisely that, to learn again of the nature of our being, of mind, of language, and of life.